out what we call a methodology for investigating cases, for innocence projects to investigate cases. Well, 6 years ago, when we started on this venture, I think we kind of underestimated how difficult it's going to be. We thought you just get a case in and you just start investigating. That's it. But when we actually got the papers in, which took us almost a year to get, an almost complete set of documents. When we did get papers in, we didn't really know what to do with them. We were reading through them, but we didn't quite know what we were looking for. We were looking at forensic reports that we didn't understand the values to what they meant. And it took us a good couple of years to start to get grips with, how do you start investigating the case. And the reason why we included this chapter, investigating your wrongful convictions, it's for Innocence projects as well, just as a guide, on where do you start, what do you look for in a case. Now the first step before you can even start investigating, what do you think it is? Asking for the retention of evidence. Because if you don't get the evidence retained, you don't get the documents retained, there's nothing you can actually investigate. So that's the first step. And in this book, we talk about the retention policies of forensic science providers, the police, the prisoners' own lawyers, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, but there are a few points which I would like to stress when it comes to retention of evidence. The first point is that although police, the forensic science providers, CPS, they all have their protocols in terms of retention of evidence, none of these protocols could actually guarantee that material would be retained indefinitely. So the police, for instance, their retention policy is covered under the Criminal Procedures and Investigation Act. But in that act, it says that police only have to hold evidence until the person is released from custody or after the Court of Appeal or the CCRC says no. So if you've been released from custody, you've lost in your appeal, the case has been rejected by the CCRC, there are no guarantees that police will still hold the material. And also, these policies don't cover what they call items of perishable nature. So Michael mentioned cases like Sean Hodson, Neil Hurley, DNA cases. But these retention policies don't cover things like blood samples, biological swabs, hair samples. They don't tend to cover them. In fact, these things are often destroyed even before the defendant gets convicted. So even before conviction, you get a destruction order saying that we are going to destroy these things. And a lot of lawyers don't know to respond to this destruction order. They think, oh, all right, they've done the testing, they couldn't find anything, just let them destroy it. So they don't respond to the destruction order, and a lot of the samples get destroyed. But what's interesting about this, when it comes to destruction of evidence, even if you get a destruction order, there are times when the Forensic Science Service, for unintentional reasons, it could just be that they're too disorganized, they actually don't destroy the evidence. So you mentioned the case of Sean Hodson just now. What was interesting about Sean Hodson was that DNA testing was identified in his case 11 years ago. And when his solicitor first asked the FSS, have you still got a semen sample in the storage? They said, oh, we've destroyed it, we've lost it. It was only 11 years later, after a lot of investigation, that they found that the semen sample actually still existed. So technically, Sean Hodson could have been released 11 years earlier. And we are seeing this in our own cases as well. So in the case of Neil Hurley, there was a destruction order saying that the blood samples that we want to do DNA testing on, have been destroyed. But we just got confirmation from the Forensic Science Service recently that they've actually got 7 packets of material in their frozen storage. Now the things that you keep in your freezer aren't going to be clothing. It's going to be biological samples, swabs, blood samples. So we're very, very hopeful that the samples actually still exist, and we can do DNA testing on it. So that's the retention policy of forensic science providers. And I think the third point that I want to stress is that when you finally get the case material in, they do take up a lot of space. So if any of you are thinking about, setting up an Innocence project, you do need quite a big office. Because in a case, you might get 8 cabinets of case documents, and that's the reality of it. But it's important that you do not destroy any documents at all. So a lot of our prisoners, when they send the documents to us, they actually filter through them. So they go, this witness statement is not important, I'm just going to throw it away, it's taking up too much space. You mess all the documents up. But it is very crucial that you keep every single piece of correspondence, every single piece of paperwork because the evidence of your innocence could lie in that documents that you think are irrelevant. Now, once you've got all the documents in, the first step in starting to investigate the case, I know I said that's the first step, but that's not really the first step. No, this is the first step. So actually start to understand how the conviction was actually obtained. So a lot of prisoners go, well, it's redundant, isn't it? I was sat in my trial for 2 weeks. Of course I know why the jury convicted me. But that's not always the case, actually, because you find that a lot of prisoners, and their families as well, they got so emotionally overwhelmed during the trial that they can't really objectively assess the situation, or they may be hearing legal jargons that they don't quite understand. I mean, the trial process, it is quite a complicated procedure to understand. So when you get a case, you've got to, the first thing you start to look at is to try to understand how the prisoner got convicted in the first place. So ideally you would want the trial transcripts, but getting the whole set of trial transcripts, we tried to get it for one of our cases. They gave us an invoice for, was it $9.5 grand plus VAT. Now a prisoner can't afford that. We can't fund that as well. And I think in the United States you get your trial transcripts as of right, but you don't have the same policy in this country. So very rarely do you actually get the transcript of the entire trial. But the next best alternative is to start looking at the judge's summing up, the transcript of the judge's summing up. Because that, you can get it when you're making an application for leave to appeal. You can get it from the court registrar. And there are two accounts that you've got to look at when you're looking at judge's summing up. And it's quite obvious, actually. The first one, what's the prosecution's case? You know, what's the prosecution's narrative? What's the account of what happened? Why it happened? What's the motive? How it happened? When it happened? Where it happened? And what's the defense case at trial? That's simply, I didn't do it, prosecution's evidence is unreliable, or was there something more to that? Like the defendant might be claiming, well, the witness has got a motive in making an allegation against me. Or actually, I was in a different place at a different time when the crime occurred. And what we found in this wrongful conviction cases that we look at is that there are more than two sides to every story. There's actually three. You've got the prosecution's case, you've got the defense case, and then you've got the prisoner's own account. Because what we come across frequently is that very often, defense at trial, it rarely reflects the entirety of the prisoner's own claim. So the prisoner's lawyer might, for tactical reasons, decide to not pursue a certain line of inquiry, not call a certain witness at trial. So for our cases, we ask them to give us, as much information as you can about your claim of innocence. Is there anything that your lawyers could have presented at trial, but they didn't for whatever reasons? And we find that the defense, a lot of times, the defense at trial probably reflects only about 50, 60%, sometimes even less, of what the prisoner is actually saying. And when you're doing innocence projects work, it's very important at the start to actually establish the prisoner's own claim of innocence and start to see whether or not the evidence stacks up. And once you've looked through the trial documents and all that, you've got to go beyond the trial documents. That's the third step. Because normally, in a police investigation, there could be hundreds of witnesses that were being interviewed by the police, hundreds of statements taken. You get 10, 20 reports done. But very often at trial, whatever is presented, it only constitutes a very small percentage of all the evidence that's actually gathered in the course of a police investigation. So the prosecution, for instance, they are going to be selecting what they think supports their case, what they think is important. And defense lawyers make subjective judgments as well about what they should present in court, what they should use at trial, what they should be following up on. So it's very important to go beyond the trial documents and start getting the unused material in, unused witness statements, scene of crime logs, and records of house-to-house inquiries. And in this book, we provide a general checklist of some key documents that you need in order to actually start to do a thorough investigation into a claim of innocence. Now, when you're going into all this unused material, the way we go about telling our students what to look at when you're investigating a case is, is there anything in this unused material that supports the defense case, but also weakens the defense case? because as Innocence projects, we are coming at this from an impartial and objective perspective. We're not just looking for evidence that supports the prisoner. We are looking at, is there anything that could actually undermine his own claim of innocence? So in one of the cases that we've been working on for 4 or 5 years, we were looking through the unused material, and we found things in there that actually indicates, further supports the prisoner's guilt that the prosecution didn't even actually realize. And when we bring the evidence to him, he couldn't explain it. So we've got to close the case and explain to him why we think he's guilty. That's what we do as Innocence projects. Sometimes you come across a case, you find that the person's innocent. Sometimes you find things that further supports the person's guilt. And I think most crucially as well, as you're looking through this unused evidence and start tabulating on the scene of crime records, is there anything in there that might suggest, a different account than what was actually accepted at trial, what's put forward by the prosecution and accepted by the defense? What do I mean by that? Well, in the case of Neil Hurley, this is a case of, he was convicted of the murder of his ex-partner. His ex-partner was attacked, allegedly, in the middle of the night on her way back home. And when we're going through the house-to-house inquiries, we came across a lot of witnesses reported hearing that they gave very similar accounts. We heard, a woman screaming. At the time, that was about 2 or 3 hours later than what was actually put forward by the prosecution. And these are things that, So when you're looking through the unused evidence, because I said just now that establish what the prosecution's case is, establish what the defense case is, establish what the own prisoner's claim of innocence is. So when you start going through the unused material, the way we approach it is by interrogating all those things. Does it fit the story? Does the evidence fit the story? Now, what we often tell our Innocence project is that, very broadly, there are 2 ways of overturning or challenging a wrongful conviction. The first one is by discrediting the evidence that led to the conviction, and the second way is by trying to find evidence that positively establishes your innocence. Now, these 2 approaches are not mutually exclusive, and we often tell them you've got to do both. So if you're working the case that's based on fibrous evidence, for instance, you try to knock down the reliability of fibrous evidence, and you try to think outside the box and find new ways in establishing innocence. And I think in recent years we started looking at using DNA, and this is what I want to focus on now actually. Well, in the United States, I think for the last 10 years there have been close to 300 DNA exonerations, and I think in 50% of these cases the real perpetrators of these crimes are actually found. But in this jurisdiction, I think over the last 2 years there has only been a handful of cases. I think the first case was a case of Michael Shirley, and that was back in 2000, early 2000. And more recently, you get a case of Sean Hodgson, which Michael mentioned just now. And we suspect the reason for this is that a lot of lawyers don't have, a good understanding of DNA or forensic science. When they see a forensic science report, they just give it to an expert. The knowledge about DNA seems to be, quite well, basically, that lawyers don't really know much about science, put it simply. And, it's the same with our students as well. When we go look at DNA, they go, I don't know what SGM is, I'm not going to touch it. And they try to avoid it. But it's not that hard to understand. And, I think it's something that's underutilized in this jurisdiction, and we can really, start to overturn cases through DNA. So if you've got a case like Sean Hodgson that's convicted pre-DNA, so say in the late 80s or the early 90s, you might want to start to ask the question, are there any samples left behind that you could potentially do DNA testing on? So in the case of Neil Hurley again, he was convicted in 1994, and DNA was available then, but it wasn't regularly used by the police. So in his case, only blood grouping was done and didn't yield anything against him. In fact, one of the results actually proved that it could not be him, might prove that it could not be him. It was a sock with blood on it that was found to contain, the blood group didn't match him, didn't match the victim, but in the forensic report it says because it didn't match both of them, it's therefore irrelevant to the crime. So we're asking for DNA testing to be done on that as well. But if you get cases like that, that's pre-DNA or DNA wasn't used, start looking at whether there's anything in the samples, any samples that's left behind mutate that might, that could be subjected to DNA testing. And alternatively, even if it's a recent case and DNA testing was done, which is, and majority of the cases that we are working on fall into that category, you might want to start looking at what testing was actually done on that case, on the samples. Has there been any new developments in DNA technology since then that could actually yield results when originally they couldn't? So in this book, we provide an introduction outline of some of the key DNA techniques that have been developed in the last 10 years. So things like low copy DNA, YSTR, touch DNA, SGM+, and these are just some of the techniques that have been developed over the last 10 years that could yield results from much less quantity of samples, much more degenerated samples. But there's a couple of caveats that I would like to add to this. The first one is that all DNA evidence, like all evidence, have to be interpreted within a context. So in the case of Sean Hodgson, where it's a rape and murder case, and you've got semen sample left behind, and that proved that it wasn't, and that DNA testing proved that it didn't match Sean. That's quite strong evidence of exoneration. But if you only conduct, say, low copy DNA on the crime scene, you find a DNA profile that doesn't match the suspect, and you can't tell the origins of the DNA profile. So you can't tell if it comes from sweat, you can't tell if it comes from blood, you can't tell if it comes from semen. That doesn't really mean anything. So that's the first thing I want to say about DNA testing. The second thing is that the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. So we get a lot of cases where prisoners go, they didn't find any DNA on me. They didn't find my DNA in the crime scene. I'm innocent. Now that's not evidence of innocence because, some people are shadows, some people are non-shadows, for instance. And what do I mean by that? This is an analogy that's often used by Professor Alan James in the Forensic Institute. So I can be shaking my ghost hand. I can conduct murder now. I might leave his DNA behind, but not mine, because he's a shadow and I'm non-shadow. Or the person who committed the crime may be wearing gloves. So the fact that you didn't find any DNA is not itself evidence of exoneration. So this is something that we always have to try to explain to our prisoners as well. So you do all this investigation, you find evidence of innocence, you find evidence that proves that the case is unreliable. What do you do next? You present the story to the Court of Appeal, to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and we concluded this chapter by saying, by talking about the importance of giving the full story. And what do we mean by that? I think a lot of times, a lot of lawyers and our own prisoners as well, they look at the application form to the CCRC, and all it says is, have you got any fresh evidence? So rather than giving the whole story about their claim of innocence, they start to second guess what the audience want here, what the CCRC wants, what would constitute good grounds of appeal. Now, what we're saying is that don't just limit yourself to what you think are grounds of appeal. Give the full story. Now, why is that important? It's important because every ground of appeal you find has to be contextualized. People have to understand why it's that important. So, for instance, if you are appealing conviction, the basis that cell site evidence against you is unreliable. And cell site evidence is this technology they've got now, where they can actually put you in a certain location based on your mobile phone records and your mobile phone signal. So if you've been convicted on that, and increasingly a lot of people are, and you found evidence now that suggests that the cell site evidence is unreliable, rather than instead of just going to the Court of Appeal or to the CCRC saying, I've got this new report, it proves that the evidence is unreliable. Apart from that, also give the other evidence that about how possibly the eyewitness didn't identify you. You might have an alibi that proves that you weren't at the scene of the crime. And even though these things were argued at trial or could have been available at the time of the trial and don't technically constitute grounds of appeal, it strengthens your case about why the cell site evidence is unreliable. And also, I think a single legal ground alone might not be able to persuade the Court of Appeal. It might not persuade the CCRC that you've got a real possibility of a conviction being quashed. But that, alongside other evidence that proves your innocence, might just tip the balance and get the case referred. And finally, I think it's also very important to bear in mind that whether you're dealing with judges, parole board judges, judges at the Court of Appeal, commissioners at the CCRC, they are humans as well. And it could only benefit your case if you actually give the full story. Now, I think one thing I would like to stress is that, this is just a general guide, to help Innocence projects have a starting point when they get the paperwork in. Bye. And we do see a lot of cases where, people work 10, 15 years investigating cases. They might even find very strong evidence of innocence, very strong evidence that the evidence that led to conviction was unsafe. But still, for procedural reasons, the CCRC refused to refer the case, or the Court of Appeal decided to persist in maintaining the conviction. And it's for this reason that we also included in the book a chapter on utilizing the media. It's by Dr. Eamon O'Neill, who's an investigative journalist, about how you can use, other things apart from law, using campaign groups, using the media to actually get your story out there. And it's only by doing that we can start to get reforms to the criminal justice system, start to pressure the criminal justice system into, doing something about cases like that.